This is Sarah's Country. Now, the last topic that I really want to get your thoughts on, as well as our last expert commentator following the question that I put to our 5 agricultural spokespeople. This is one of the most urgent and major, especially with climate change and change of land use across this country. All New Zealanders, every single one of us, whether we rely on it from a rural property or within urban New Zealand, we are reliant on accessing water when it's needed. And of course, increasing weather patterns, dry weather patterns, will make us more and more vulnerable. We are really starting to feel the reality of this, and hopefully our politicians are getting their head around the major job it is, shovel ready or not. I asked all of them, how will your party enable pragmatic solutions for the benefit of both rural and urban areas and provide that urgent infrastructure?
And look, we have spent literally tens and up to $100 million on water infrastructure. Actually, it's across drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater for the small towns. But of course, for water storage, for irrigation and agriculture, where there's been extensive use of that, and will continue to be so in the future as the climate changes and some areas get drier and drier. So we're not only supporting actually the projects themselves, such as in Northland, but we're actually improving the level of knowledge. So we're going out investigating more possible schemes. Many people have talked about schemes around the country in all the dry regions, but they haven't had the ability to go and do the research. So that's what we'll be looking to do. And as I say, as a government, we understand the climate is going to change. It will affect the way that we farm. Our reliance on water will increase, and that we're committed to and will continue to spend money on water storage as a core part of support for our primary sectors.
David Bennett from the National Party.
This is a fundamental policy that we just released last week around water storage and water infrastructure. So there are many arguments within this issue, and so we'll start with sort of the base issue is that you need water for resilience in time of dry weather, but also for growth. And effectively, horticulture is one of our huge growth areas in the primary sector going forward, and it needs water. You can't grow kiwi fruit and apples and other horticultural products to the extent that we want to without good water sources. And that is the prime issue within horticulture at the moment, making sure there's that access to water. Now, unfortunately, the current government has cancelled the water projects that were going to be in train that we had in a previous iteration of the Crown irrigation, and they've only carried on the ones they had to, and then they've only had a couple of small projects they've done in recent years, and they've made it very clear they're not into major scale water storage. They only want very small projects, and that doesn't achieve the purpose of resilience that you talk about, and also of growth. So that's the first point. Second point is that New Zealand is a lucky country. We have a lot of water resources, and we need to store and use that water. We're one of the few countries in the world that have that resource of that scale for the size of our country, and we simply are afraid to use it. And we're told it's a bad thing to use water storage when we actually need to embrace it because that's our economic potential going forward. The third issue is that the movement away from the word irrigation to the words urban, rural, and environmental is a key component of any water storage proposal these days. So going back to that irrigation issue, that raises the conjecture of whether it's about dairy farming, increased emissions and such like. Whereas if you look at it from a resilience point of view, and you have an urban aspect, a rural aspect, and an environmental aspect, then water storage really takes on its own new light. And a great example of that is in Timaru, for example, in that area. There's a water storage project there that would enable development of the land between the water storage project and the city. Would enable the city to have water for its industrial purposes, and it would also enable some environmental outcomes like around the lagoon and river flows in the summer. So there's the potential of meshing together all three. But what we've done is we've proposed a $600 million fund that would be available for water infrastructure upgrades and also water storage. So for places like Auckland, water infrastructure upgrade is crucial for them to get their water supply. And for rural areas and provincial areas, the water storage will be a major issue. So we're giving the opportunity for all to be involved, and that will be a major impact on our productive sectors and the ability for us to continue to grow, especially in the horticultural sector.
Eugenie Sage from the Green Party.
In urban areas, it's quite critical that we have much more sustainable water conservation measures, things like households having rainwater tanks that they can then use to water gardens in summer without impacting on the reticulated supply. And it's about people being more water savvy generally. I think we've got a lot to learn from Australia. It's about looking at how we, at the wider landscape level, look at issues like fire management as well, which are another issue as a result of unstable weather patterns, increasing periods of drought. And in rural areas, our Farming for the Future policy is about enabling small-scale water storage on farm and more focus and research into dryland type crops, things like quinoa, things like hemp, and work there to look at crops which don't need as much water as, say, dairying does in areas like the Mackenzie. So it's a mosaic of measures, and we do have to think long term about this and really invest in some smart thinking.
Mark Cameron from the ACT Party.
Look, the simple reality is that we, as the ACT Party, would go straight to the RMA. I mean, other parties have used this as a political football pre-election for many election cycles. We've advocated this for a long time. We've got to repeal and replace that. That all too often, that 900-page document actually stops getting things done at a central government level, a regional level, and right down to the farm gate. So the first thing we do is work about getting rid of the RMA in the current format and repeal and replace it. When you talk about water storage at a council level, councils around the country, regions around the country know their own physical topography, the seasonal variations in rainfall, the normal climate. And, I mean, you compare Northern to the South Island as a prime example. We're a wonderfully skinny little country stretched from one end to the other. So we've really got to have a tailored solution. The worst thing is we make this a central government reality. So the government should get out of the way of council where as possible, so council can create these solutions, and government streamline the funding to create it.
Mark Patterson from the New Zealand First Party.
Yeah, well, we've been massive proponents of water storage within the previous government. In fact, the Provincial Growth Fund funded 37 water storage projects at various stages of their conception, $90-odd million there. We honoured the previous Crown infrastructure irrigation investment, or the main ones that were in the advanced stages, and we think that this is the lowest of low-hanging fruit for agriculture. We need to mitigate against climate change. What we would want to see is a national stock take, actually, rather than it being kind of driven totally by the on-the-ground grassroots farmers trying to pull things together and get a scheme up and running for government funding. We actually think there's room for some top-down strategic looking into this, identify where the opportunities are, and work with those farmers on the ground and local councils, because we've got a lot of water, we just don't get it at the right time in the right place. And it's of incredible strategic national importance that we leverage those resources that we have.
This is Sarah's Country. Well, we just heard there, lastly, from Mark Patterson about, rain not being the issue. It's about how we capture it and redistribute it as being the problem. The question I asked them at the start of, you've just joined us here on Sarah's Country's election special, was how will your party enable pragmatic solutions for the benefit of both rural and urban areas? And what would you do to provide that urgent infrastructure? And our expert commentary on this particular, there is no other, I believe, at the moment, is the current CEO of Irrigation New Zealand, Elizabeth Soal, who joins us now on this election special. Evening, Liz. There's quite a few different views going on there. Before we get into some of the bureaucracy around water infrastructure, I want to go straight to those comments out Eugenie Sage's mouth with regards to us looking to Australia to mitigate fires, especially following the Lake Ohau fire situation. It seems like a very interesting comment to make.
Yeah, it is. And certainly when we think about water storage and the options that it provides for communities as a whole, providing water for firefighting purposes is absolutely one way that we can use water and should be available for the community. We know that increased fire risk is something that's going to happen under climate change. And so how we manage our water, because that's going to be a risk, is absolutely something that we should be taking into account.
And mitigating the prevention of fire. I know there'll be a lot of people watching and listening will be thinking about that, as opposed to, of course, putting out that fire. So, of course, National wanting to go straight back to the Crown Irrigation Investment Fund they established. Naturally understandable about large storage and rolling back a lot of the infrastructure. What would you feel confident that National would get underway should they be elected post-Saturday, and some of those previous projects that a lot of people have been hanging their hats on?
Yeah, so I think what's positive about their policy is that it looks at investing in irrigation infrastructure and water storage infrastructure as just that, an investment, because we know that our river systems and our rainfall patterns are going to be so different under climate change that actually it's really important that we look at investing significantly now in irrigation and water storage in general infrastructure to enable us to respond to climate change, but also to enable boosts to regional economies, particularly in a post-COVID world, because it will allow for economic development. So we would have liked for there to be more investment in water storage projects as part of those infrastructure projects that have been invested in as shovel-ready responses to the COVID-19 crisis. So there's a lot that aren't necessarily shovel-ready, but it's certainly on the list of projects that would certainly support our regions and the country as a whole.
And this is not to see an expansion in dairy necessarily. I know in the North Canterbury area, there's a huge expansion in horticulture happening in that particular area, as well as many other land uses that can benefit from this, and also the economies of scale of an urban supply and the environmental mitigation in our wildlife and fisheries as well. So, I mean, overarching, what has this Labour Green New Zealand First coalition been able to achieve in this space? Damien opened up saying we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars. Where has those dollars landed?
Yeah, so there has certainly been investment through the Provincial Growth Fund in water storage projects in Northland, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, and looking at water infrastructure more generally. And so that is a positive, and our sector is very pleased that is going ahead, particularly in those areas like Northland, where there is a lot of economic potential that can be gained from investing in water infrastructure. So that is a positive. What the next government would look like if there isn't a provincial growth fund in place, that's more of a concern for us. It's not necessarily that communities want to receive grant funding or handouts for irrigation infrastructure or water storage infrastructure, but it's about providing the supporting environment in terms of regulations and that sort of thing to enable some of these projects to get off the ground, and bringing together all the different parts of the community that can benefit from water storage, so that those who share the benefits are also sharing the costs as well.
And Mark Cameron there, to finish from ACT, was really quick to judge the RMA and the reform on the table, the support for regional councils to be able to see the paperwork and the process, the long years and years and sometimes decades for these particular infrastructure projects to actually get to, as you said, putting the shovel in the ground.
That's right. I mean, it's interesting because often actually getting the pipes in the ground is one of the easiest parts in the process. But you're absolutely right. It can take over 10 years, if not more, to get these projects from conception through to build stage. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So some of it is through the consenting process, but it's not just that. It can be for a range of reasons, but absolutely there's processes under the RMA that could be improved to enable some of these projects to go ahead a lot more quickly, and the government has said that that can happen under their faster track consenting process that will occur for some of those infrastructure projects that they've announced under the COVID-19 response. But it's something that we need to look at more generally as to the effectiveness and efficiency of the RMA planning process to enable these sorts of things to happen.
Liz, 2017 election was the election of water. How are you feeling 3 years on and the progress that we have made, and where the consensus lies between those five parties we've just heard from?
Yeah, so it certainly was. Water was a hot topic, and the freshwater regulations and what was proposed in the policy manifestos that the various parties put out before the last election was extremely, it led to a lot of firm discussion in the community, can I put it that way? We haven't seen those sorts of issues being raised as election issues per se, but it is good that most of the parties have water on their agendas. It's just that they're not all given the same priorities that they are. As I've said before, we have been consistent in our messaging to all political parties that there needs to be an overarching water strategy guiding New Zealand, and that we need to have planned sustainable investment in water infrastructure for all sectors in the community, because it's only going to get worse under climate change. And so we're still hopeful that whoever's in government next will prioritise this and recognise it for the critically important issue that it is.
Thank you so much. The CEO of Irrigation New Zealand, Elizabeth Soal, there is our expert commentator on this particular question around the urgent water infrastructure and where each of those political parties stand.